afternoon again, Year 8. Last lesson I asked you to have a go at reading through the first half of Vultures and answering my questions on the side. So we're going to spend some time during the Do Now today just going over the answers to those questions. So basically there were 4 questions, okay, and we were having a think about what the ideas were within the poem, okay. So I asked you to think about what is being described. So they're vultures, which is a type of bird, perched on trees looking for food, ready to scavenge. Okay, so basically vultures are very popular because if there's any kind of dead animals out in the wild, they'll eat from them. So that's why they're ready to scavenge. They're kind of always looking around for corpses. So where is it set? It is set in a wet, miserable place at dawn. There are dead trees there and waterlogged trenches. So it doesn't have a specific place, but obviously if we think about trenches, perhaps places where there's dead trees, it's going to be quite warm usually, isn't it? So we're probably thinking of somewhere abroad rather than in England. So what do vultures look like? Well, the vultures look ugly. They are described negatively. So they are described as having dirty, ugly feathers, and their heads look like they're bashed in. So essentially, I think we're quite negative towards vultures because we know what they do. They essentially eat, you know, dead animals and whatnot, and that then kind of creates this really negative imagery. You know, they have quite dark feathers, quite an odd shaped head, bold. You know, they don't look like a friendly animal, do they? So we don't necessarily connect those positive images to them. And how do they act? So although they look ugly and act in a disgusting way, picking at the eyes of swollen corpses, they still have love and affection towards each other, and they are leaning affectionately towards each other in a dead tree. So even though, you know, we have lots of negative things about them, actually this poem focuses quite a lot on some of the positive things about vultures and the fact that towards one another they're actually quite loving, but actually towards other things, that's where that negativity kind of comes from. So make sure you've marked your answers in green pen. If you didn't get any answers, make sure you copy down the right ones. So we're going to start off with you rereading the poem, okay? And I'd like you to write down as many open questions as you can think of. So open questions are questions that require more than a yes or no answer, okay? And we want to really understand, so why is this poet decided to write about vultures? And what are some of their certain kind of behaviours? So if you could speak to the poet, what would you ask them, basically, okay? This should take about 5 minutes. So now we've thought about the beginning of the poem quite heavily, we're going to read the next verse in the poem. And I'll pre-warn you, everything changes, okay? So what I've come up with is a couple of questions for the different parts. So you're going to read this stanza first, and then I'd like you to have a go at answering the questions. Now they are in order, so this is question 1 up here, then we move on to question 2, and then on to question 3. And they aren't just one question, they have lots of different ideas to try and get the most out of you. Remember to answer questions in full sentences if you can. Obviously, this is all for revision purposes, so if you were to come back to it, you should be able to understand what I'd asked you to do. That's the idea, okay? So have a read through it, answer the questions that you can, and then when you've finished, you can move on to the next slide, and we're going to go through the answers together. I suggest this should take about 10 minutes, so make sure that obviously you're not overrunning too much. Now, as I've said previously, the great thing about English is that there's never a right or wrong answer. It's all about interpretations and justifications. So if you interpret it in one way and your partner interprets it in a different way, you can still both be right. It just means that you have inferred different things from the text, okay? So when I say green pen this and mark your answers, mine aren't necessarily 100% the answer. These are just my interpretations, but we should have pretty similar interpretations, okay? So the next stanza says, strange indeed, how love in other ways so particular will pick a corner in the charnel house, tidy it and coil up there, perhaps even fall asleep, her face turned to the wall. So my first question was, what do you think when you think of the word love? And I asked you to list me some positive adjectives. So I put kindness, romance, affection, family, friends, okay? And obviously there's many more, isn't there, to do with love, but for me, that's what encompasses love, okay? So when they're speaking about love, I'm thinking of those things, which is quite different from the vultures and them picking the dead corpse in the previous stanza. So then question 2. So a charnel house is somewhere to store old bones or skeletons. So would you expect to find love there? Why or why not? Well, no, because it looks like a horrible place. So there's the image here. you know, when nothing lives, it looks quite frightening, and love is the opposite to that for me. Okay. And how does this link to the vultures in the first place? Because they look horrible and frightening, but they still find love with each other. So the charnel house is kind of this representation that something can, you know, have negative kind of characteristics. A charnel house is literally a place for people's dead bodies where their bones and skeletons have kind of fallen to pieces. But actually, you know, love can still be found there. Those people were once loved by lots of people. And that's kind of the same with the vultures. So even though they go and they, you know, seek out the dead and they eat the dead, actually towards one another, they're very loyal and they love each other. So why do you think that love has turned her face to the wall? Because she doesn't want to see the horrible parts. She just wants to see the parts, you know, where they're in love with each other. What is she trying to ignore? So she's trying to ignore the negative parts of life, so death and that sort of thing. And what is the poem saying about love? That love exists everywhere, even in horrible or ugly situations. Okay, so actually what seemed like it was going to be quite a negative poem and seemed like something that perhaps we weren't really going to enjoy, actually has a really nice message to it, that, you know what, there's nastiness and negativity everywhere around us, but actually quite a lot of things aren't what they appear on the surface, and quite a lot of things aren't, you know, as they seem. So I'm hoping that you can see that obviously this poem has turned into something quite different to what we imagined. So the final task for today's lesson is just to kind of think a little bit more in depth about what this poem could be about. So we've spoken about the fact that it's the idea, obviously, that some things might be ugly on the outside but beautiful on the inside. So how could we relate that to everyday life? So for example, you know, the vultures, yes, eat things, but they're eating to survive. So the beauty of it is that it keeps them alive. That it describes animals doing horrible things, but actually they're doing it for the right reasons because they're eating to survive. Or it might be about the way people look. So maybe it's about somebody looking a certain way on the outside, but their inside being very different. So can you come up with any other ideas? How might this idea of something being ugly on the outside relate to it being pretty on the inside? Can you think of any everyday scenarios that might link up with that? And then that's the end of today's lesson, and this is the last time we're going to have a look at the Vultures poem. I hope you've enjoyed having a look at it. It's something a bit different. Again, not necessarily diversity of cultures, but diversity of thinking about animals and actually the way that we, you know, kind of stereotype animals as well. Make sure you have a go at the Show My Homework quiz.